At a small-town charity event, 6-year-old Tommy Martinez clutches a crumpled piece of paper with his wish written in crayon. While other children ask for toys or treats, Tommy approaches a group of leather-clad Hells Angels bikers and whispers his simple request, "Can you be my dads for a day?" The crowd falls silent, expecting rejection or laughter. Instead, something extraordinary happens. The biggest biker, a man called Bear, kneels down to Tommy's eye level and says, "We'd be honored." Little man, what started as an innocent wish becomes a day that transforms not just Tommy's life, but touches millions around the world. These rough-looking men with their thundering motorcycles and intimidating appearance show a gentleness that brings tears to everyone watching. But what happened during those magical 24 hours that made grown men cry and changed how the world sees brotherhood? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Tommy Martinez had learned not to expect much from life. At 6 years old, he possessed the careful wisdom that comes from disappointment served too early and too often. His small hands smoothed the wrinkled paper against his thin legs as he sat on the folding chair beside Mrs. Henderson, watching the other children at the charity event laugh with their fathers. The paper contained his wish, written in purple crayon with the careful block letters his teacher had taught him. "I want a dad for one day." The words looked smaller now than they had when he'd written them in the quiet of Mrs. Henderson's kitchen that morning. Tongue poking out in concentration as he formed each letter, Mrs. Henderson meant well. At 73, she had opened her home to foster children for over 20 years, but Tommy knew he was likely her last. Her arthritis made it hard for her to keep up with an active boy, and her fixed income stretched thin to cover his needs. She provided safety, food, and shelter, the basics that had been missing from too many of his previous placements, but she couldn't give him what he craved most. A father's strong arms and rough voice saying his name with pride. Tommy's foster care file, thick with reports and evaluations, told a story of a system overwhelmed and understaffed. Born to a teenage mother who disappeared when he was 2, he had bounced between relatives who couldn't afford another mouth to feed and foster homes where he was just another case number. The file documented his quiet nature, his eagerness to please, and his tendency to withdraw when adults raised their voices. What it couldn't capture was the careful hope he carried in his chest. Protected like a small flame, he wouldn't let anyone blow out. The Father's Day charity event had seemed like fate when Mrs. Henderson mentioned it. Local businesses donated money and prizes, while families enjoyed games, food, and entertainment. But for Tommy, watching fathers teach their sons to throw footballs and seeing daughters climb onto broad shoulders, the event felt like looking through a window at a life he could never have. He had prepared for this moment for 3 days. First came the wish, written and rewritten until the words looked right. Then came the plan, practiced in whispers to his reflection in Mrs. Henderson's hallway mirror. He would be polite but confident. He would ask nicely, and maybe, just maybe, someone would say yes. The Hells Angels had arrived an hour earlier, their motorcycles rumbling into the parking lot like gentle thunder. Tommy watched from his chair as families instinctively stepped back, mothers pulling children closer, fathers positioning themselves protectively. But Tommy saw something different in these men. Beneath the leather jackets and intimidating appearance, he recognized something familiar, the careful way they moved around the children, the gentle voices they used when speaking to the elderly volunteers. The respect they showed to everyone they met. Mrs. Henderson had noticed his interest. "Those are the Hells Angels, Tommy. They come every year to donate money to the Children's Fund. They help kids." "They do indeed. Sometimes the people who look the scariest on the outside have the biggest hearts inside." Tommy had studied them throughout the afternoon, watching how they interacted with others. The biggest one, the man the others called Bear, had kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled. When a little girl had dropped her ice cream, Bear had quietly bought her another one. When an elderly man struggled with his walker, two of the bikers had offered assistance without being asked. These were not the scary men that some of the other adults seemed to think they were. These were men who understood kindness, who knew how to be gentle with fragile things. These were men who might understand what it meant to want a family. As the afternoon wore on, Tommy felt his courage building. The wish paper grew damp from his sweaty palms, but his resolve strengthened. He had learned that life rarely gave you what you wanted unless you were brave enough to ask for it. And sometimes even then the answer was no, but sometimes, if you were very lucky and very brave, the answer might be yes. Tommy stood up from his chair, smoothed his best shirt, the blue one Mrs. Henderson had bought him for church, and began walking toward the group of Hell's Angels. Each step carried him closer to either the biggest disappointment of his young life or the beginning of something magical. Bear Mackenzie had seen enough violence in his 42 years to last several lifetimes. The dog tags hanging beneath his leather vest bore witness to 2 tours in Afghanistan, where he'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. Now, watching a small boy approach their group with determined steps and nervous eyes, Bear felt something stir in his chest that had nothing to do with his military training and everything to do with the father he'd once hoped to become. The Riverside chapter of the Hells Angels had gathered around their motorcycles in the charity events parking area, a collection of men bound together by shared experiences, mutual respect, and a code of brotherhood that ran deeper than blood. To outsiders, they appeared intimidating. Leather-clad giants with weathered faces and arms covered in tattoos that told stories of roads traveled and battles fought. But Bear knew the truth behind their fearsome reputation. Jake Hammer Morrison stood beside his custom Harley, adjusting the small American flag attached to his handlebars. At 55, Hammer was the oldest member of their group, a Vietnam veteran whose Purple Heart medal was tucked safely in his wallet, alongside pictures of the grandchildren he visited every Sunday. His calloused hands, scarred from decades of construction work, were the same hands that had built wheelchair ramps for disabled veterans and playground equipment for the local elementary school. Next to him, Rico Wheels Fernandez polished chrome that already gleamed like silver. At 38, Rico was the group's mechanical genius, capable of rebuilding any engine ever made. His garage served as an unofficial community center where neighborhood kids learned about responsibility and respect while helping him restore classic cars for charity auctions. The elaborate dragon tattoo that covered his left arm concealed smaller ink, the names of 3 foster children he and his wife had adopted over the years. Tommy "Tank" Sullivan, despite his intimidating nickname, spoke with the gentle voice of a man who spent his weekdays teaching high school history. His students knew him as Mr. Sullivan, the teacher who stayed after hours to help struggling kids and who used his own money to buy supplies for those who couldn't afford them. The leather jacket that made him look dangerous during weekend rides hung in his classroom closet beside dress shirts and ties. But his values remained constant in both worlds. Mouse, the youngest member at 28, had earned his nickname not from his size. He stood 6'3" and weighed 250 pounds, but from his quiet nature and careful way of speaking. A former Navy medic, he worked as a paramedic and had saved more lives than he could count. The medical training that had served him in military hospitals now helped him assist at charity first aid stations and community health fairs. Bear himself carried the weight of leadership among these men, a responsibility he'd accepted not through dominance, but through service. His Purple Heart and Bronze Star medals sat in a drawer at home, but his real pride came from the work they did as a group, escorting funeral processions for fallen veterans, organizing toy drives for underprivileged children, and providing security for community events where their imposing presence kept troublemakers at bay, while their generous hearts kept hope alive. They had come to today's charity event, as they did every year, to donate money raised through their monthly poker games and bike rallies. The check in Bear's pocket represented countless hours of community service and fundraising. But their real contribution was their presence, showing local families that brotherhood came in many forms and that judging people by their appearance was often a mistake. As Tommy approached, Bear noticed the careful way the boy held himself, shoulders squared, chin up, but hands trembling slightly with nervousness. It reminded him of young soldiers preparing for their first mission, scared but determined to do what needed to be done. The boy's clothes were clean but worn, his shoes scuffed but carefully tied, his hair combed with the precision of someone who understood that appearance mattered when you had something important to say. The men noticed Tommy's approach too, and Bear felt their protective instincts activate. These were men who had learned to read danger in a dozen different languages, but they also recognized innocence and courage when they saw it. Whatever this child wanted to say, he would be heard with the respect due to someone brave enough to approach a group of strangers with hope in his heart. Bear straightened his shoulders and prepared to listen, unaware that the next few minutes would change not only Tommy's life, but also their own understanding of what it meant to be a father. Tommy's legs felt like rubber as he approached the circle of motorcycles, but he forced himself to keep walking. The charity event program Crumpled in his free hand featured a smiling father and son on the cover, advertising the Father's Day Wishes activity that had given him this impossible idea. The program had suggested children write down their wishes and share them with their families. But Tommy had no family to share with, only a hope that someone might want to share with him. The conversations around the event grew quieter as people noticed the small boy walking determinedly toward the Hells Angels. Mothers instinctively pulled their children closer, fathers stepped protectively in front of their families, and elderly volunteers paused their activities to watch. What they assumed would be either an embarrassing mistake or a dangerous encounter. Mrs. Henderson noticed Tommy's absence from his chair and spotted him just as he reached the edge of the biker group. Her hand flew to her chest and she started to rise, but something in Tommy's posture, the careful dignity of his approach, made her pause. She had fostered enough children to recognize courage when she saw it, even when it wore the face of a 6-year-old boy who had already learned too much about disappointment. Tommy stopped 3 feet from Bear, close enough to be heard, but far enough to run if necessary. The massive man turned toward him, and Tommy felt momentarily overwhelmed by his size and presence. Bear stood at least 6'4", with broad shoulders that stretched his leather jacket and arms that looked like they could lift a car. A graying beard covered half his face, and deep-set brown eyes studied Tommy with an intensity that should have been frightening, but something in those eyes reminded Tommy of the way Mrs. Henderson looked at him when she thought he was sleeping, with a mixture of protectiveness and sadness that spoke of understanding pain. "Excuse me, sir," Tommy said, his voice smaller than he'd intended, but clear enough to be heard. The other bikers stopped their conversations and turned toward him, creating a semicircle of attention that felt both supportive and overwhelming. Bear knelt down on one knee, bringing himself closer to Tommy's eye level. The movement was fluid and natural, the gesture of someone comfortable around children. "What can I do for you, son?" The endearment hit Tommy like a physical touch. Son, when was the last time someone had called him that? He looked into Bear's kind eyes and felt something loosen in his chest. A knot of loneliness that had been there so long he'd forgotten it could be untied. Tommy unfolded his wish paper, the purple crayon words now slightly smudged from his sweaty palms. He cleared his throat and read aloud, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I want a dad for one day." The words hung in the air like a prayer. Around them, the charity event seemed to hold its breath. Parents who had been watching with suspicion now felt something different, a recognition of a child's simple, heartbreaking honesty that cut through all assumptions and prejudices. Bear felt the impact of those words in his chest. in the place where he'd buried his own dreams of fatherhood after his wife died and left him alone with only memories and regrets. He glanced at his brothers, seeing his own emotions reflected in their faces: surprise, understanding, and something deeper, the recognition of a moment that demanded the best of who they were. "You want a dad for one day," Bear repeated softly, not as a question, but as a confirmation of something sacred. Tommy nodded, then added quickly, "I know you're probably busy, and I know I'm not your real kid, but Mrs. Henderson says sometimes people help kids even when they don't have to, and I thought maybe—" His voice trailed off as the magnitude of his request settled over him. He had asked for something impossible, and now he waited for the gentle rejection that would send him back to his chair and his dreams. Bear looked at the boy's hopeful face, at the careful way he held himself despite his fear, at the courage it had taken to approach a group of strangers with such a vulnerable request. In that moment, Bear understood that this wasn't just about one little boy's wish. This was about what kind of men they chose to be when faced with someone who needed them. "We'd be honored, little man," Bear said, his voice thick with emotion. "We'd be honored to be your dads for a day." The transformation in the atmosphere was immediate and profound. What had started as a moment of tension dissolved into something warmer, something that spoke to the better angels of human nature. Bear's acceptance had not only changed Tommy's day, it had changed everyone who witnessed it. Mrs. Henderson approached slowly, her weathered face showing a mixture of concern and curiosity. She had spent enough years working with children to recognize when something significant was happening, and the gentle way these intimidating men were now surrounding Tommy told her that her instincts about their character had been correct. "Tommy, are you sure about this?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Tommy looked up at her with eyes brighter than she'd seen them in months. "They said yes, Mrs. Henderson. They said they'd be my dads for a day." Bear stood and extended his hand to Mrs. Henderson. "Ma'am, I'm Bear Mackenzie. I want you to know that your boy will be safe with us. We take our responsibilities seriously." As they shook hands, Mrs. Henderson felt the calluses of honest work and saw the sincerity in his eyes. "I can see that. Tommy's been looking forward to this event for weeks. He doesn't ask for much." The other Hell's Angels members had formed a protective circle around Tommy, each one introducing himself with the same gentle respect they would show their own family members. Rico knelt down and pointed to the colorful patches on his leather vest, explaining what each one meant: the road trips they'd taken together, the charitable causes they supported, the brotherhood that bound them across all differences. Tommy's eyes widened as he examined the intricate designs. "What does this one mean?" he asked, pointing to a patch that showed an eagle with spread wings. "That's for freedom," Rico explained. "It reminds us that everyone deserves to feel free and safe, especially kids like you." Hammer showed Tommy the small American flag on his motorcycle, sharing stories about the veterans they honored every Memorial Day with their annual ride to the National Cemetery. "We never forget the people who came before us," he said, "and we never forget to take care of the people who need us now." Tank, despite his intimidating nickname, spoke with the patient voice of a teacher as he explained how each motorcycle was customized to reflect its owner's personality. "Your bike tells your story," he told Tommy. "What story would you want your bike to tell?" Tommy considered this seriously. I think I'd want it to tell the story of a boy who found a family." The words hit each man differently, but the impact was the same, a recognition that this child had given them something as precious as what they were giving him. In choosing to trust them, Tommy had reminded them why they'd formed their brotherhood in the first place, not just for themselves, but to be better men than the world sometimes expected them to be. Mouse, true to his gentle nature despite his imposing size, had quietly disappeared and returned with a small gift from the charity event's prize table, a miniature motorcycle keychain. "Every biker needs his first bike," he said, pressing it into Tommy's palm. "This one's yours." Tommy clutched the keychain like it was made of gold. It was the first gift he'd received from a father figure in his memory, and the significance wasn't lost on any of the adults watching. The crowd that had initially viewed this interaction with suspicion now found themselves moved by the genuine care being shown. Parents began to reconsider their initial judgments. Children tugged on their father's sleeves, asking if they could meet the nice bikers too, and volunteers paused their activities to witness something that was becoming more beautiful with each passing moment. Bear looked down at Tommy, who was examining his new keychain with wonder, and felt a familiar ache in his chest, the same feeling he'd had watching other men's children grow up while his own arms remained empty. But this time, the ache was accompanied by something else, the opportunity to matter in a child's life, even if only for one day. "So, son," Bear said, the word coming more naturally now, "what would you like to do first with your new family?" Tommy looked around at the 5 men who had just transformed from strangers into something unprecedented in his young life. A group of people who had chosen him, if only temporarily. The possibilities seemed endless, but one thing was clear: this was going to be the best day of his life. Bear's custom Harley-Davidson stood like a magnificent steel horse in the afternoon sun, its chrome reflecting the sky and its deep blue paint job gleaming with the care of someone who understood that beautiful things deserved respect. For Tommy, who had only seen motorcycles from a distance, being invited to climb aboard felt like being asked to ride a dragon. "First things first," Bear said, producing a child-sized helmet from his saddlebag. "Safety always comes before adventure." Tommy's eyes widened as Bear placed the bright red helmet on his head, adjusting the straps with the careful attention of someone who understood that protecting what you care about is the first rule of love. The helmet was slightly too big, but Bear had come prepared with padding that made it fit snugly. "Where did you get a kid's helmet?" Mrs. Henderson asked, surprised by the forethought. Bear's weathered face softened. "We escort a lot of charity rides. Kids with sick parents, families going through tough times. We learn to be prepared for moments when a child might need to feel like they're flying." The simple explanation revealed layers of compassion that had been invisible to the casual observer. These men didn't just show up to events. They came prepared to meet whatever needs they might encounter, prepared to be the answer to prayers they hadn't even heard yet. Tommy's small hands gripped the helmet excitedly as Bear showed him how to climb onto the massive motorcycle. The leather seat seemed enormous, but Bear's strong arm provided security as Tommy settled in behind him. The boy's legs barely reached the foot pegs, but Bear had adjusted them to accommodate his small passenger. "Hold on tight to my belt," Bear instructed. "And if you get scared or want to stop, just tap my shoulder twice, okay?" Tommy nodded solemnly, understanding that this was serious business, but also the most exciting thing that had ever happened to him. As Bear started the engine, the motorcycle rumbled to life with a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, powerful but controlled, wild but tamed by the hands of someone who respected its strength. The first few moments were overwhelming. Tommy felt the vibration through his entire body, heard the deep, throaty roar of the engine, and experienced the strange sensation of being part of something much larger and more powerful than himself. But instead of fear, he felt exhilaration. This was what freedom sounded like. Bear pulled slowly out of the parking lot, mindful of his precious cargo. They rode through the town at a leisurely pace, but to Tommy it felt like they were flying. The wind rushed past his helmet. The world blurred by in a stream of colors and shapes. And for the first time in his young life, Tommy felt what it was like to be the center of someone's protective attention. People on sidewalks turned to watch them pass. Some waved, recognizing the local Hells Angels and their reputation for community involvement. Others simply smiled at the sight of the massive biker with his tiny passenger, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing something special. Tommy's laughter was audible even over the engine noise. Pure, uninhibited joy that spoke to something fundamental about childhood and wonder. Bear felt it too, that infectious happiness that reminded him why moments like this mattered more than anything else in the world. They rode past the elementary school where Tommy attended classes, and he felt a surge of pride, imagining what his classmates would think if they could see him now. Past the grocery store where Mrs. Henderson shopped for their modest meals. Past the library where he spent quiet afternoons reading about adventures he never thought he'd experience himself. As they approached the riverside park, Bear slowed the motorcycle to a stop beside a picnic area where families were enjoying the afternoon. Tommy remained seated for a moment, reluctant to let the experience end, still feeling the thrill of movement and the security of Bear's protective presence. "How was that, son?" Bear asked, turning to look at Tommy's face. Tommy's grin was so wide it threatened to split his face in half. "That was the best thing ever." "Can we do it again?" Bear chuckled, a sound that rumbled from deep in his chest like the motorcycle's engine. "We've got all day, little man." That was just the beginning, and in that moment, as Tommy's laughter echoed across the park and drew smiles from strangers, Bear understood that this day would change him as much as it changed the boy. Sometimes being a father wasn't about biology or legal documents. Sometimes it was about choosing to show up when someone needed you. Most Millie's diner had been serving the community for 37 years, and Millie Patterson had seen every kind of customer walk through her doors. But when 6 Hells Angels motorcycles pulled into her parking lot, followed by curious families from the charity event, she knew this was going to be a morning to remember. The bikers entered first, their presence filling the small diner with leather and road dust. But their voices were gentle as they asked Millie if she could accommodate a special guest. Behind them walked Tommy, still wearing his oversized helmet and grinning like he'd just conquered the world. "Well, I'll be," Millie said, her weathered face breaking into a smile. "And who might this young man be?" "This is our son," Bear said simply, his hand resting protectively on Tommy's shoulder. "He's having breakfast with his dads today." The word son seemed to transform the entire atmosphere of the diner. Other customers, who might have felt uncomfortable with the unusual group, instead found themselves charmed by the obvious care being shown to the small boy. Families who had followed from the charity event took nearby tables, wanting to witness more of this unexpected story. Tommy was guided to a corner booth where he could sit, surrounded by his new family. Rico slid in beside him, while Bear took the opposite seat, with the other 3 men arranging themselves to create a protective circle around their young charge. To anyone watching, it looked exactly like what it was, a family gathering for a meal. Millie approached with coffee for the men and a special placemat for Tommy, one of the paper ones designed for children, featuring games and puzzles. But Tommy wasn't interested in the activities. Instead, he pulled out the crayons Millie provided and began drawing on the blank back of the placemat. "What are you making there, buddy?" Tank asked, leaning over to see. "It's my family," Tommy said matter-of-factly, his tongue poking out slightly as he concentrated on his artwork. He drew 6 stick figures standing beside what looked like motorcycles. 5 were large and 1 was small, but they all held hands in a crooked line across the paper. The drawing was simple, executed with the unsteady hand of a 6-year-old, but its meaning was profound. In purple and blue crayon, Tommy had created his first family portrait. 5 men who had known him for less than 2 hours, and 1 little boy who had waited his whole life to belong somewhere. "Can you tell us about each person?" Mouse asked gently, pointing to the stick figures. Tommy pointed to each drawing in turn. "That's Bear, 'cause he's the biggest and he let me ride his motorcycle. That's Rico, 'cause he told me about the patches. That's Hammer, 'cause he showed me the flag. That's Tanker, 'cause he's going to teach me about bikes. And that's Mouse, 'cause he gave me my first motorcycle." He paused at the smallest figure. "And that's me, 'cause I'm part of the family now." The simplicity of his explanation hit each man differently, but the impact was universal. Here was a child who had been given so little that a few hours of attention felt like a lifetime of love. His drawing would have made any father proud, but for these men, who had never expected to be chosen as someone's dad, it was deeply moving. When Millie came to take their order, Tommy studied the menu with the serious concentration of someone making an important decision. Bear noticed his careful attention to the prices and gently told him, "Order whatever you want, son. This is a special day." Tommy chose pancakes with chocolate chips, orange juice, and bacon, a feast by his usual standards. As they waited for their food, the conversation flowed naturally. The bikers shared stories about their adventures on the road, their work in the community, and their own childhoods. Tommy listened with rapt attention, asking questions that showed he was genuinely interested in learning about these men who had welcomed him so completely. When their food arrived, Tommy looked around the table at his temporary family and felt something he'd never experienced before, the certainty that he was exactly where he belonged. The pancakes were perfect, the orange juice was cold, and the bacon was crispy, but more than that, he was surrounded by people who had chosen to care about him as he ate. Tommy continued adding details to his drawing, carefully coloring in each figure and adding names beneath them in his careful block letters. When he finished, he held it up proudly. "This is for you to keep," he told Bear. "So you remember our family breakfast?" Bear accepted the drawing with hands that trembled slightly, understanding that he had just received a gift more precious than anything money could buy. Bear's motorcycle garage sat behind his modest house, like a cathedral dedicated to mechanical precision and honest craftsmanship. The building had once been a barn, but Bear had transformed it into something that spoke to his soul, a place where broken things could be made whole again, where patience and skill could restore beauty to what others might consider beyond repair. Tommy's eyes widened as they entered the garage, taking in the organized chaos of tools, parts, and half-assembled motorcycles in various stages of restoration. The air smelled of motor oil, metal polish, and the indefinable scent of purposeful work. Sunlight streamed through high windows, illuminating workbenches that showed the wear patterns of decades of use. "Welcome to my sanctuary," Bear said, his voice carrying a pride that had nothing to do with ego and everything to do with the satisfaction of meaningful work. "This is where I come to think, to create, and to remember what really matters." Against one wall hung a worn leather tool pouch, its surface cracked with age and use. Bear noticed Tommy's curious gaze and lifted the pouch down carefully, handling it with the reverence reserved for sacred objects. "These were my father's tools," Bear explained, opening the pouch to reveal hand tools that were clearly decades old, but maintained in perfect condition. "He taught me that a man's tools are an extension of his hands, and his hands are an extension of his heart." Tommy reached out tentatively, then stopped. "Can I touch them?" "Of course, son. But first, let me teach you the most important rule about tools." Bear knelt down to Tommy's level. "We always treat them with respect, because someone's livelihood depends on them working properly. And we always put them back where we found them, so the next person can find what they need." Tommy nodded solemnly, understanding that he was being taught something important about more than just tools. Bear guided his small hands as they explored each implement. The perfectly balanced hammer that fit Bear's father's grip, the set of wrenches worn smooth by countless repairs, the screwdrivers with wooden handles shaped by decades of use. "My dad was a mechanic too," Bear continued, his voice soft with memory. "He taught me that fixing things isn't just about making them work again. It's about understanding how they're supposed to work, respecting the person who built them originally, and taking pride in doing the job right, even when no one's watching." Bear selected a simple project for them to work on together, adjusting the chain tension on one of his restored motorcycles. It was a task that required precision, but wasn't too complex for small hands to help with. He showed Tommy how to hold the tools properly, how to apply just the right amount of pressure, how to check their work to ensure it was done correctly. "Why do you fix old motorcycles instead of just buying new ones?" Tommy asked as he carefully held a wrench in position. Bear considered the question seriously. Sometimes the old things are worth saving. They have character, history, stories to tell. A new motorcycle might run perfectly, but an old one that's been restored with love and care, well, that has soul. As they worked together, Bear found himself sharing stories about his father, about the lessons learned in garages and workshops, about the satisfaction that comes from creating something beautiful with your own hands. Tommy listened intently, absorbing not just the words, but the values behind them, the importance of patience, the value of craftsmanship, the idea that some things were worth preserving, even when it would be easier to replace them. "Can you teach me to build a whole motorcycle someday?" Tommy asked, his small hands now confidently holding tools under Bear's guidance. "Building a motorcycle takes years to learn," Bear said thoughtfully. "But I'll tell you what, if you want to keep learning, I'd be honored to teach you. A good craftsman always needs an apprentice." Tommy's face lit up with possibilities. In his young mind, he could see a future stretching ahead. Weekends spent in this garage, learning the mysteries of engines and mechanics, growing into someone who could create beautiful things with his own hands. When they finished their work, Bear showed Tommy how to clean and return each tool to its proper place in the leather pouch. As Tommy carefully arranged the last wrench, Bear felt a connection spanning 3 generations, his father who had taught him, himself as the student who became the teacher, and now Tommy as the next link in a chain of knowledge and respect that would outlive them all. "Every craftsman needs his first tool," Bear said, reaching into a drawer and pulling out a small screwdriver, perfectly sized for Tommy's hands. "This one's yours to keep." The black sedan pulled into Bear's driveway with the unmistakable authority of official business, its government plates catching the afternoon sun like a warning. Through the garage window, Bear and Tommy could see a woman in a crisp business suit stepping out, her expression set in the carefully neutral mask that social workers learned to wear when delivering unwelcome news. Tommy's face drained of color as he recognized the uniform of the system that had shaped his entire short life. He'd seen enough social workers to know that their arrival usually meant change, and change in his experience rarely brought good things. "Is she here to take me away?" Tommy whispered, his small hand instinctively reaching for Bear's much larger one. Bear squeezed Tommy's hand reassuringly, though he felt his own protective instincts rising. "Let's go see what she wants, son. Sometimes people just need to check that everything's okay." Janet Morrison stepped out of her sedan, carrying the kind of folder that contained a child's entire documented life. At 38, she had been a social worker for 12 years, long enough to develop strong opinions about appropriate placements and proper procedures. Her business card, crisp and white in her jacket pocket, represented the authority of the state system that had ultimate say over Tommy's welfare. Mrs. Henderson met them at the front door, her expression showing the same wariness that crossed her face whenever authority figures arrived unannounced. She had fostered children long enough to know that surprise visits rarely brought good news. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm Janet Morrison from Child Protective Services," Janet said, her voice carrying professional courtesy laced with concern. "I've received several calls this afternoon about Tommy's unusual placement today." Bear stepped forward, Tommy still holding his hand. "I'm Bear Mackenzie. Tommy's been with us today at his own request." Janet's gaze moved between the imposing biker and the small boy, her training telling her this was exactly the kind of situation that required immediate intervention. "Mr. Mackenzie, I'm sure your intentions are good, but there are proper procedures for child supervision. Tommy is a ward of the state, and his placement with unauthorized individuals raises serious safety concerns." "Safety concerns?" Mrs. Henderson's voice carried the sharp edge of someone whose judgment was being questioned. "These men have been nothing but kind and respectful. Tommy has been happier today than I've seen him in months." Janet opened her folder, revealing forms and documentation that represented the bureaucratic maze that governed Tommy's life. "Mrs. Henderson, I understand your perspective, but we have protocols." Background checks, home studies, proper supervision ratios. Mr. Mackenzie and his associates haven't been cleared for child interaction. Tommy stepped closer to Bear, his young mind understanding that this conversation was about whether he would be allowed to keep his new family, even for the remainder of this one precious day. The fear in his eyes was the same look Bear had seen in the faces of young soldiers facing their first combat, the recognition that forces beyond their control were about to determine their fate. "Ma'am," Bear said, his voice respectful but firm, "I understand your concerns. We're not asking to take Tommy home or change his living situation. We're just spending the day with a boy who asked us to be his family for a few hours." Janet's expression softened slightly as she looked at Tommy, seeing the obvious attachment that had formed. Her training told her to end this irregular arrangement immediately, but her experience with children showed her something else, a boy who was experiencing genuine care, possibly for the first time in his life. "The calls I received expressed concern about Tommy being with members of a motorcycle club," Janet continued. "There are assumptions about lifestyle, about influences that might not be appropriate for a vulnerable child." "What assumptions?" Mrs. Henderson asked pointedly. "These men donated money to the charity event. They've been respectful to everyone they've met. They've shown Tommy more genuine fatherly attention in one afternoon than he's received in years." Janet looked again at Tommy, noting his clean clothes, his bright expression, the way he instinctively moved closer to Bear when feeling threatened. Whatever these men's reputation might be, the child showed no signs of fear or distress, quite the opposite. "I'll need to make some calls," Janet said finally. "Verify backgrounds, check references. Until then, I'm afraid Tommy needs to return to his approved placement." Tommy's grip on Bear's hand tightened, and for the first time all day, tears threatened to spill from his eyes. The beautiful day that had seemed too good to be true was proving to be exactly that, too good to be true. Bear knelt down to Tommy's level, his voice gentle but strong. "Hey, little man, whatever happens, today happened. Nobody can take that away from us." Word traveled fast in small towns, especially when it involved protecting something precious. Within an hour of Janet Morrison's arrival, Bear's front yard began filling with an unlikely coalition of community members who had come to vouch for the Hells Angels and the special day they were sharing with Tommy. Millie Patterson arrived first, still wearing her diner apron and carrying a manila envelope filled with what she called character evidence. Behind her came Father Michael O'Brien from St. Mary's Catholic Church, followed by Principal Sarah Chen from the elementary school, and Dr. Robert Martinez from the community clinic. Janet Morrison stood on the front porch, her folder of official documents feeling increasingly inadequate as she faced a growing crowd of respected community members, each carrying their own collection of character reference letters that painted a very different picture of the men she'd been warned about. "Ms. Morrison," Millie said, stepping forward with the confidence of someone who had served coffee to half the town for 37 years. "I think there's been some misunderstanding about these gentlemen." She opened her envelope and pulled out a stack of handwritten letters. "These are from families whose children have been helped by the Hells Angels over the years. Hospital visits for sick kids, fundraisers for families who lost their homes, escort services for funeral processions of veterans who had no family." Father O'Brien nodded in agreement. "Bear and his brothers have been volunteering at our Veterans Support Group for 3 years. They've helped more struggling men find purpose and sobriety than any program we've ever run." Dr. Martinez stepped forward with his own documentation. "They've organized blood drives, funded medical equipment for low-income families, and personally transported elderly patients to appointments when no other help was available. These men are pillars of our community." Janet found herself in the unusual position of having her professional assumptions challenged by overwhelming evidence to the contrary. She looked at Tommy, who was watching the proceedings with wide eyes, clearly amazed that so many people would speak up for his new family. Principal Chen approached with a folder of her own. "Ms. Morrison, Tank Sullivan is one of our substitute teachers. He's passed every background check we require, and our students adore him. If these men aren't suitable to spend time with children, then our entire screening system is flawed. I appreciate everyone's input, Janet said, struggling to maintain her professional authority in the face of such united community support. But there are still protocols that failed this child. Mrs. Henderson interrupted, her voice carrying the weight of years spent caring for forgotten children. Tommy has been bounced between placements, overlooked by the system, and made to feel like he's not worth anyone's time. Today, for the first time in his life, he's experienced what it feels like to be someone's priority. Mouse stepped forward, his gentle voice carrying clearly across the yard. Ma'am, I understand your concerns about safety. I'm a licensed paramedic. Hammer is a certified first aid instructor. Rico has emergency response training. Tank has passed background checks to work with children professionally. We're not asking to take custody. We're asking to finish giving a little boy the best day of his life. Janet looked at her folder, then at the crowd of community leaders, then at Tommy himself. The boy stood close to Bear, not from fear, but from attachment, his small hand holding the screwdriver Bear had given him like a talisman of belonging. What exactly would you need to verify our suitability? Bear asked, his tone respectful but determined. We'll submit to whatever checks you require. Janet pulled out her phone and began making calls. First to the state database for criminal background checks, then to local law enforcement for character references, then to the Veterans Administration to verify military service records. With each call, the evidence mounted in favor of the men who stood accused of being unsuitable influences on a child. 20 minutes later, Janet closed her phone and looked at the assembled crowd. Her professional training warred with the evidence before her eyes. A child who was clearly thriving in the care of men, whose backgrounds checked out flawlessly, and whose community standing was beyond reproach. Tommy, she said, kneeling down to his level, are you happy here? Do you feel safe? Tommy nodded vigorously. They're the best dads ever. They taught me about motorcycles and tools and being respectful, and they said I could visit them again. Janet stood slowly, understanding that sometimes the best interests of a child couldn't be found in procedure manuals or official protocols. Sometimes they could only be found in the courage to recognize genuine care when it appeared in unexpected forms. You can finish your day, she said finally, but I'll need to file a full report, and any future contact will need to go through proper channels. The cheer that went up from the crowd was loud enough to wake the neighbors. 16-year-old Madison Parker had originally planned to spend her Saturday sleeping, late and scrolling through social media. Instead, she found herself at the charity event, helping her mother with the volunteer check-in table, bored and looking for any distraction from the endless parade of families and their predictable activities. When she noticed the small boy approaching the intimidating group of bikers, Madison's teenage instincts kicked in. This was either going to be embarrassing or dangerous, and either way, it would be more interesting than counting raffle tickets. She pulled out her phone and started recording, expecting to capture either a heartwarming rejection or a moment she might need to show to. Authorities later, what she captured instead was 47 seconds of pure magic. The video began with Tommy's nervous approach, his small voice barely audible as he made his request. Madison kept filming as Bear knelt down, as the other bikers gathered around protectively, as the boy's face transformed with joy at their acceptance. She caught Tommy's delighted laughter, Bear's gentle responses, and the moment when a simple wish became something extraordinary. Madison stopped recording when Tommy climbed onto Bear's motorcycle, thinking she had captured a sweet local story that might get a few likes on her Instagram. She uploaded it without much thought, adding the caption, "Little boy asks bikers to be his dads for a day, and they said yes." Faith in humanity restored. Within minutes, her phone began buzzing with notifications. Likes, comments, shares. More activity than she'd ever seen on any of her posts. By the time Tommy and the bikers returned from their first ride, Madison's video had been viewed over 1,000 times. An hour later, That number had climbed to 10,000. The video's appeal was immediate and universal. In an era of negative news and divisive rhetoric, here was a story that spoke to something fundamental about human kindness. The contrast between the bikers' intimidating appearance and their gentle response to a child's innocent request created a narrative that challenged assumptions and touched hearts. Comments began pouring in from around the world. "This is why we shouldn't judge people by their appearance. Those men have bigger hearts than most people I know. That little boy's smile just made my whole day. Real men protect and care for children. These are real men." Madison watched in amazement as her follower count exploded. News outlets began reaching out, asking for permission to use her video. Local television stations called her phone. Her moment of casual documentation had become something she never intended. Viral content that was spreading faster than she could track. But as the video gained momentum, not all the responses were positive. Some comments criticized the decision to allow a child near dangerous criminals. Others questioned the wisdom of letting gang members interact with vulnerable children. The polarized reactions reflected broader societal divisions about appearance, assumptions, and who was deemed worthy of trust. By evening, Madison's phone was ringing constantly. National news producers wanted interviews. Social media companies were featuring her video on their trending pages. The 47 seconds she had captured on a whim were being seen by millions of people around the globe. Madison found herself torn between excitement about her sudden internet fame and concern about the unintended consequences. She had shared what she thought was a beautiful moment, but she was beginning to understand that she had also thrust Tommy and the Hells Angels into a spotlight they hadn't asked for. The video showed Tommy's pure joy, but it also revealed his vulnerability. Comments speculated about his background, his living situation, why he had no father figure in his life. People began sharing the video with their own stories of absent fathers, foster care experiences, and the importance of chosen families. As night fell and the view count reached the hundreds of thousands, Madison realized she had documented more than just a heartwarming encounter. She had captured a moment that spoke to universal human needs, the desire to belong, the power of unexpected kindness, and the way love could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances. Her phone buzzed with a message from a national morning show producer. "Can you put us in touch with the boy and the bikers? America wants to hear their story." Madison stared at the message, understanding that her simple video had opened a door that couldn't be closed. Tommy's wish for a father for one day was about to become a story that the entire world wanted to hear. She looked at the view counter one more time. 847,000 views and climbing. Tomorrow, Tommy Martinez and the Riverside Hells Angels would wake up famous. Bear woke to the sound of his phone ringing at 6:47 a.m., an ungodly hour for anyone who wasn't expecting an emergency. The caller ID showed Mrs. Henderson's number, and his first thought was that something had happened to Tommy during the night. "Bear, you need to turn on the news." Mrs. Henderson's voice was breathless with excitement and concern. "Tommy's on television." Still groggy, Bear fumbled for his remote and turned on the local morning show. What he saw made him sit bolt upright in bed. Madison Parker's video was playing on the screen, accompanied by commentary from news anchors who were calling it the most heartwarming story of the year. By the time Bear had showered and dressed, his phone showed 47 missed calls and hundreds of text messages. The video had exploded overnight, jumping from thousands to millions of views across multiple platforms. Tommy's simple wish had become a global phenomenon. The reactions were as varied as they were passionate. Bear scrolled through printed comments that Mrs. Henderson had brought over, each one representing a different perspective on their story. These bikers proved that family isn't about blood. It's about showing up when someone needs you. Finally, a story that shows the media what real masculinity looks like. Protecting and caring for children. I was in foster care for 8 years. This video made me cry because I remember what it felt like to wish for a family. My dad was a Hell's Angel, and he was the most loving father any kid could ask for. People need to stop judging books by their covers, but not all the comments were supportive. This is irresponsible. These men are criminals and shouldn't be around children. Where was Child Protective Services? This is exactly how children get hurt. Motorcycle gangs are dangerous organizations. This video glamorizes criminal behavior. That poor child is being exploited for publicity. Bear felt a knot forming in his stomach as he read the negative reactions. He and his brothers had simply responded to a child's innocent request with kindness, never imagining it would spark a national debate about their character and worthiness to interact with children. The phone rang again. This time, it was a producer from a national morning show, followed by calls from news networks, documentary filmmakers, and book publishers. Everyone wanted to interview Tommy, to tell their side of the story, to capitalize on the emotional impact of the video. Rico called to report that reporters were camped outside his garage. Tank received word that news vans were parked at his school. Mouse discovered that his hospital had been contacted by journalists asking about his background. Hammer found photographers taking pictures of his house. The overwhelming attention felt surreal and invasive. These men had spent years quietly serving their community, working jobs, raising families, and supporting causes they believed in. They had never sought publicity or recognition for their charitable work. Now they found themselves thrust into a spotlight that felt both validating and uncomfortable. At the same time, the positive responses were deeply moving. Veterans wrote to thank them for representing military service members with honor. Teachers shared the video as an example of looking beyond appearances. Parents used their story to teach children about kindness and acceptance. A letter from a retired Hell's Angel in California brought tears to Bear's eyes. "You boys made us all proud." That little man chose well when he picked you as his family. Another message came from a foster parent in Texas. "I've been fostering for 15 years, and I've never seen a child light up the way Tommy did in that video. You gave him something precious, the feeling of being chosen, but perhaps the most meaningful responses came from other children in foster care. Social workers from around the country reported that the video had sparked conversations about family, belonging, and the different forms that love could take. By noon, the view count had surpassed 5 million, and major news outlets were running segments about the story. The video had been translated into 12 languages and was trending on every major social media platform. Mrs. Henderson arrived at Bear's house with Tommy, who seemed simultaneously excited and overwhelmed by the attention. He clutched the screwdriver Bear had given him, his talisman of belonging, as reporters called out questions and cameras clicked. "Are we famous now?" Tommy asked Bear, his 6-year-old mind struggling to understand the magnitude of what was happening. Bear knelt down to Tommy's level, blocking the view of the cameras with his body. "We're the same people we were yesterday, little man. The only thing that's changed is that more people know about our family now." Tommy nodded solemnly, then brightened. "Does this mean more kids might find their dads too?" Bear felt his heart squeeze. Even in the midst of overwhelming attention, Tommy was thinking about other children who might need what he had found. In that moment, Bear understood that regardless of fame or criticism, they had done something that mattered. They had shown one child what it felt like to be chosen, and in doing so, they had reminded the world what love looked like. The interview request came from Sarah Chen, the host of Good Morning America, and it carried the weight of national television's most trusted morning show. Bear sat in his living room, surrounded by his brothers, as they debated whether to accept the opportunity to tell their story to 20 million viewers. "We never asked for this attention," Tank said, running his hands through his hair. "Maybe we should just let it die down naturally." "But look at these messages," Rico countered, holding up his phone filled with emails from foster families, veterans groups, and children's advocacy organizations. People are saying our story is making a difference. The transcript of the interview, which would be broadcast live from the local news station, represented their chance to control their narrative. For days, others had been telling their story, interpreting their actions, and debating their character. This would be their opportunity to speak for themselves. Bear made the decision that would define how the world understood their story. We do the interview, not for us, but for Tommy, and for every other kid who might see that someone cares. The interview setup was simple but professional. Sarah Chen, participating via satellite from New York, appeared on a large monitor while Bear, Tommy and Mrs. Henderson sat together on a couch in the local studio. Tommy wore his best shirt, the same blue one from the charity event, and clutched his motorcycle keychain like a security blanket. "Bear," Sarah began, her voice warm but professional. "When Tommy approached you that day, what went through your mind?" Bear's response was measured and thoughtful. "I saw a little boy who had the courage to ask for what he needed most. In that moment, saying no wasn't an option. Any man worth his salt would have done the same thing, but some critics have questioned whether members of a motorcycle club are appropriate role models for children. How do you respond to those concerns?" The question hung in the air, representing months of prejudice and assumptions that Bear and his brothers had faced throughout their lives. Bear's response was calm but firm. "Judge us by our actions, not our appearance. We're veterans, teachers, first responders, and community volunteers. We've been background checked, character referenced, and vetted by every organization we work with. If that's not enough to qualify us to spend time with a child who asked for our help, then the problem isn't with us, it's with a system that values prejudice over proof." Sarah turned to Tommy, her voice gentling for the 6-year-old. "Tommy, can you tell us about your day with your new dads?" Tommy's face lit up with the same pure joy viewers had seen in the original video. "They taught me about motorcycles and tools and being respectful. Bear gave me my first tool. Enrico showed me his patches, and Mouse gave me a motorcycle keychain. They made me feel like I was special. What was the best part of the day?" Tommy considered this seriously, his young mind working through memories that had already become precious to him. "When Bear called me son. Nobody ever called me that before, but it felt right, like I belonged somewhere." The simple honesty of his answer created a moment of television that transcended entertainment and entered the realm of pure human connection. Across the country, viewers found themselves moved by the authenticity of a child's joy at being claimed by someone who cared. Mrs. Henderson spoke about Tommy's transformation, how his confidence had grown, how he talked constantly about his dads and their lessons about respect, hard work and kindness. She described a boy who had gone from withdrawn and careful to engaged and hopeful. "The impact on Tommy has been remarkable," she said. "But what struck me most was watching these men step up without hesitation. They didn't ask what was in it for them or worry about inconvenience. They saw a child who needed them, and they responded with open hearts." Sarah's final question addressed the broader implications of their story. "What message do you hope people take from this experience?" Bear looked directly into the camera, speaking not just to the television audience, but to every person who had ever been judged by their appearance, every child who had ever felt unwanted, every adult who had ever had the opportunity to make a difference in someone's life. Family isn't about DNA or paperwork or social approval. It's about showing up when someone needs you, treating others with respect and kindness, and understanding that we all have something to offer if we're brave enough to care. Tommy taught us, as much as we taught him, that love doesn't come with conditions or requirements. It just comes when you're open to giving and receiving. The interview ended with Tommy showing his screwdriver to the camera and explaining that it was his first tool from his first dad. The same image of the small boy proudly displaying his gift became the defining moment of a story that had already touched millions of hearts. Around the world, the mail began arriving in overwhelming volumes 3 days after. The national television interview, Bear's modest home became an unofficial distribution center for letters, packages and care packages from around the world, each one representing a life touched by Tommy's story. Among the thousands of messages, one letter stood out for its careful handwriting on yellowed paper that spoke of age and dignity. The return address showed Robert Chen, Vietnam veteran, San Francisco, California. Bear opened it with the respect due to correspondence from an elder who had served his country. "Dear Bear and brothers," the letter began. "I'm 74 years old and served 2 tours in Vietnam with the Marines. I have seen enough of life to recognize character when I encounter it, and I wanted you to know that you represent everything that was good about the men I served alongside." The letter continued for 3 pages, sharing Robert's own experiences with prejudice and misunderstanding after returning from an unpopular war, his struggles to find acceptance in a society that judged him by his service rather than his character. He wrote about watching the interview with his granddaughter, who had asked him why people were mean to the nice men who helped Tommy. "I told her," Robert's letter continued, "that sometimes people are afraid of what they don't understand, but that true warriors use their strength to protect those who cannot protect themselves. You men understand what it means to be warriors in the truest sense." The letter was one of hundreds from veterans around the world. Marines from Australia, Army sergeants from Canada, Navy petty officers from England, all writing to express solidarity with men who had chosen to use their military training in service of community and compassion rather than conflict. But the veteran letters were just one category in the overwhelming response. Foster parents shared their own stories of children who had been inspired by Tommy's courage to ask for what they needed. Adoptive families wrote about the challenges and joys of building families through choice rather than biology. A letter from Maria Santos in Phoenix particularly moved. "Bear, my husband and I have fostered 17 children over the past 12 years. We showed them Tommy's video, and it sparked conversations about family that we never expected. 3 of our current foster children have asked if they can have choosing ceremonies, like Tommy did. Thank you for showing them that family can happen anywhere, anytime, when people care enough to say yes." Motorcycle clubs from around the country reached out to share their own community service projects. The Iron Horsemen from Detroit sent photos of their annual toy drive for hospitalized children. The Road Warriors from Texas documented their volunteer work at veterans shelters. The Thunder Riders from Oregon shared stories of their scholarship program for children of fallen military personnel. Each letter revealed a hidden network of compassion and service that existed, far from the stereotypes perpetuated by movies and media. These were men and women who had chosen to band together not for criminal purposes, but for mutual support and community. Service elementary schools from across the country sent packages of drawings from children who had been inspired by Tommy's story. One teacher from Ohio included a note: "My students have been drawing pictures of their own choosing families, the adults who make them feel safe and loved. Your story has helped them understand that family comes in many forms." The children's artwork covered Bear's kitchen table, crayon drawings of bikers with hearts on their jackets, stick figure families that included people of different sizes and colors, pictures of motorcycles with children riding safely behind protective adults. Perhaps most touching were the letters from other children in foster care. A 13-year-old from Oregon wrote, "Tommy was braver than I've ever been. He asked for what he wanted and got it. Maybe I can be brave too." An 8-year-old from Florida sent a photo of herself with her foster father, along with a note: "This is my choosing dad. He said yes when I asked if he would keep me forever." Religious leaders from various faiths wrote to commend the demonstration of Christian charity, Jewish concepts of tikkun olam, repairing the world, Islamic principles of caring for orphans, and Buddhist ideals of compassion for all beings. The story had transcended cultural and religious boundaries to speak to universal values of love and care. By the end of the week, Bear's living room was filled with boxes of mail, each one requiring acknowledgement and gratitude. The task felt overwhelming until Tommy suggested they organize a thank you party where all the Hells Angels could help write responses. "We have to thank everyone," Tommy said seriously, "because they took time to tell us we did good." In his 6-year-old wisdom, Tommy had identified the responsibility that came with their unexpected platform. To honor every person who had reached out by responding with the same care and attention they had shown him. 2 weeks after the interview aired, Janet Morrison called with news that would change everything. Tommy could have a supervised visit with his Hells Angels family. The bureaucratic machinery had finally caught up with public sentiment, and the overwhelming community support had created an opportunity for officially sanctioned time. Together, Bear's hands trembled slightly as he carved the final details into the wooden cross he had been working on for days. Made from oak that had come from a tree on his grandfather's farm, the cross measured exactly 4 inches tall, the perfect size for a 6-year-old's hands. He had spent hours smoothing the wood until it felt like silk, then carefully carved Tommy's initials on one side and the date of their first meeting on the other. Tommy arrived at Bear's house wearing his best clothes and carrying a drawing he had made for each of his dads. The pictures showed their family doing various activities, riding motorcycles, working in the garage, eating breakfast together, reading the letters from supporters around the world. "I made these so you remember all the good times we had," Tommy explained as he distributed the artwork. Each drawing was signed "Love Tommy" in his careful block letters, the words representing a child's understanding that love was something you could give freely to people who deserved it. The supervised visit felt different from their spontaneous first day together. There was an official quality to it, a consciousness that their interactions were being observed and evaluated. But underneath the formal structure, the genuine affection between Tommy and his chosen family remained unchanged. Bear presented the wooden cross during their time in the garage, the same sacred space where Tommy had learned about tools and craftsmanship. "This is for you to keep," Bear said, placing the cross in Tommy's small hands. "It's made from wood that grew on my grandfather's land, shaped by tools that belonged to my father, and carved by hands that consider you family." Tommy examined the cross with the reverence of someone who understood he was receiving something precious. The wood was warm from Bear's hands, smooth from careful sanding, and beautiful in its simplicity. But more than its physical beauty, Tommy sensed the love and time that had gone into its creation. "What does it mean?" Tommy asked, running his finger over the carved initials. "It means you're never alone," Bear explained. "It means that somewhere in this world there are people who care about you, who think about you, who want good things for your life. And it means that the love we share doesn't end just because we're not together every day." Tommy clutched the cross to his chest, understanding instinctively that this was more than a gift. It was a promise that the family he had found would remain his family regardless of official placements or bureaucratic decisions. The afternoon passed with the comfortable rhythms they had established during their first day together. Tommy helped Bear organize tools, listened to stories about motorcycle restoration, and shared his own stories about school, his friends, and his dreams for the future. Rico taught Tommy more about the meaning behind each patch on his vest, explaining how symbols could tell stories about the values people held dear. Tank shared books about famous motorcycles and the adventures of riders who had traveled across countries and continents. Mouse showed Tommy pictures from his work as a paramedic, explaining how helping people in their worst moments could be the most important job anyone could do. Hammer, despite his intimidating nickname, spoke with gentle wisdom about the importance of remembering history and honoring those who had sacrificed for future generations. He showed Tommy faded photographs from his military service, explaining how brotherhood was forged through shared challenges and mutual support. As the visit neared its end, Tommy made a request that surprised everyone. "Can we have a family prayer?" The men gathered around Tommy, their weathered hands joining his small ones in a circle that spoke to something deeper than religious observance. It spoke to the universal human need for blessing, gratitude, and hope. Tommy's prayer was simple and direct. Thank you, God, for giving me the best dads in the world. Help them be safe on their motorcycles. Help other kids find their families too. And help me be good enough to deserve all this. Love, amen. The men echoed his amen, each one understanding that they had just participated in something sacred, a child's genuine gratitude for the gift of being chosen and loved. As Tommy prepared to leave, clutching his wooden cross and wearing a smile that could have powered the entire town, Bear knelt down for one final moment together. Remember, little man, you didn't just find a family that day. You created one. And families don't end just because the day ends. The legal challenge came from an unexpected source, the Children's Advocacy Coalition, a well-funded organization that had built its reputation on protecting vulnerable children from what they termed inappropriate influences. Their lawsuit, filed in family court 3 weeks after the viral video, sought to permanently ban any contact between Tommy and the Hells Angels, citing concerns about the normalization of criminal subculture in child welfare decisions. Attorney Margaret Walsh sat across from Bear in the cramped office of Legal Aid Services, surrounded by stacks of adoption papers that represented both hope and heartbreak. At 62, Margaret had spent her career fighting for children's rights, and she had seen enough cases to recognize when love was being sacrificed to prejudice. They're arguing that the media attention has created an inappropriate relationship, Margaret explained, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who had fought similar battles too many times. They claim that allowing contact between Tommy and your group sends the wrong message about who is suitable to work with children. Bear studied the legal documents that reduced his relationship with Tommy to cold bureaucratic language. Respondents, subject, inappropriate. Associations, the papers couldn't capture Tommy's laughter during their motorcycle rides, or the careful way he held his tools in the garage, or the trust in his eyes when he called Bear Dad. What are our options? Bear asked, though he dreaded the answer. Margaret laid out the harsh reality. We can fight it, but family court tends to err on the side of caution. Even with all the community support, all the character references, all the evidence of positive impact, judges worry about liability. If anything ever happened to Tommy while he was in your care, the system would be blamed for allowing known risks around children. The irony was crushing. The same media attention that had brought them worldwide. Support had also made them targets. For those who believed that protecting children meant eliminating any elements that didn't fit conventional family structures. But Margaret had one more option to discuss. There is another possibility. Bear, have you ever considered formal adoption? The question hit Bear like a physical blow. Adoption meant permanence, legal responsibility, the transformation of their chosen family into an official one. It meant Tommy would truly become his son, not just for a day or supervised visits, but forever. I'm 52 years old, Bear said quietly. I'm a single man with a dangerous job and an unconventional lifestyle. What court would approve me as an adoptive parent? One that looks at the evidence, Margaret replied firmly. Your military service record is exemplary. Your community involvement is extensive. Your financial stability is solid. You have character references from teachers, clergy, medical professionals, and law enforcement. Most importantly, you have a child who specifically chose you as his father. Margaret pulled out a different set of forms, adoption paperwork that represented the legal path to permanent family. Tommy's parental rights were terminated years ago. Mrs. Henderson is his temporary guardian, but she's been clear that she can't provide a permanent home due to her age and health. The system needs to find him a forever family. Bear stared at the adoption papers, understanding that signing them would change his life completely. No more quiet evenings alone. No more spontaneous road trips. No more freedom to make decisions based solely on his own needs and desires. Instead, there would be school events, bedtime stories, homework help, doctor appointments, and the 1,000 daily responsibilities that came with being a parent. But there would also be Tommy's laughter filling his house, small hands eager to learn about tools and motorcycles, bedtime prayers that included gratitude for finding each other, and the profound joy that came from being needed and loved by someone who had chosen him as much as he had chosen them. The coalition's lawsuit actually works in our favor, Margaret continued. It forces the court to make a decision about Tommy's permanent placement. We can argue that the extraordinary bond between you and Tommy, witnessed by millions of people worldwide, demonstrates exactly the kind of connection that successful adoptions require. Bear thought about Tommy's wooden cross, now worn smooth from constant handling as the boy carried it everywhere. He thought about the letters from veterans and foster families around the world who had been inspired by their story. He thought about Tommy's simple prayer, asking God to help other kids find their families too. "If I do this," Bear said slowly, "if I try to adopt him, what happens if we lose?" Margaret's expression was honest but hopeful. "Then at least we'll have fought for love instead of surrendering to fear. And Tommy will know that someone was willing to fight for him." Bear reached for the adoption papers, understanding that signing them meant risking everything for the chance to give Tommy the forever family he deserved. The ripple effects of Tommy's story reached far beyond anyone's imagination, touching lives and changing perspectives in ways that would have seemed impossible from a simple 47-second video. 6 months after that first charity event, the impact could be measured not just in viral views or media coverage, but in the quiet transformations happening in communities around the world. Mrs. Henderson sat in her living room, which had become an unofficial archive of the global response to Tommy's story. The original wish paper, now carefully framed and protected behind glass, held the place of honor on her mantelpiece. Written in purple crayon in Tommy's careful 6-year-old handwriting, "I want a dad for one day," had become more than a child's wish. It had become a symbol of hope for children everywhere who felt forgotten by the world. The folder of news clippings on her coffee table told the broader story. Foster care agencies across the country reported a surge in applications from prospective parents who had been inspired by Tommy's courage to ask for what he needed. The Tommy effect, as social workers had begun calling it, was changing how people thought about adoption, foster care, and the definition of family. A letter from the Department of Health and Human Services documented the statistical impact. Foster parent applications had increased by 40% nationally since the video went viral. More significantly, the demographic of applicants had expanded to include single men, military veterans, and individuals who might previously have been overlooked due to unconventional backgrounds. But the changes went deeper than statistics. Elementary schools were incorporating Tommy's story into lessons about courage, kindness, and accepting differences. Teachers reported that children were more willing to speak up about their needs and more accepting of classmates who came from non-traditional family structures. One particularly moving letter came from a teacher in Montana. "We had a student who had been silent about his home situation for months. After watching Tommy's video, he found the courage to tell us that his foster family was mistreating him. Because of his bravery, inspired by Tommy's example, we were able to get him the help he needed." The Hells Angels organization itself had experienced unprecedented positive attention. Chapters across the country were being invited to participate in community events, school visits, and charity functions. The stereotype of dangerous outlaws was giving way to a more nuanced understanding of men who chose brotherhood, service, and community involvement. A documentary crew had approached Bear about creating a feature-length film, exploring the misconceptions about motorcycle clubs and their actual role in their communities. The project would follow several Hells Angels chapters as they participated in their regular charitable activities: toy drives for hospitalized children, funeral escorts for fallen veterans, fundraising rides for disaster victims. People always assumed the worst about us, Rico had told the filmmakers. Tommy's story gave us a chance to show who we really are. But more than that, it showed us who we could be. That little boy raised the bar for all of us. The story had also sparked important conversations about masculinity and fatherhood. Men's groups were using the video as a starting point for discussions about emotional availability, the importance of nurturing relationships with children, and the courage required to show vulnerability and love. A psychology professor from Stanford had written an extensive analysis of the video's impact. Tommy's story challenges traditional notions of masculinity by showing strong, physically imposing men choosing gentleness and care. It demonstrates that true strength lies not in dominance or intimidation, but in the willingness to protect and nurture those who need our help. International responses poured in from countries where American motorcycle culture had taken root. Hells Angels chapters in Australia, England, and Canada sent photographs and stories of their own community service projects, inspired to document and share their positive contributions. Perhaps most importantly, Tommy's story had changed how people talked about foster care and adoption. The narrative had shifted from focusing on problem children who needed to be fixed to recognizing resilient kids who simply needed to be chosen and loved. A social worker from Oregon wrote, "We've started calling it the Tommy question. When children in our care ask, who would choose me, we now have an answer. We tell them about a little boy who was brave enough to ask for what he needed and about the amazing men who said yes. It gives them hope that someone out there might be waiting to say yes to them, too." Mrs. Henderson traced her finger over Tommy's framed wish paper, remembering the nervous little boy who had practiced his request in her hallway mirror. That same boy was now sleeping peacefully upstairs, secure in the knowledge that he had not just found a family, he had shown the world what love looked like when people were brave enough to ask for it and generous enough to give it. The simple wish, written in purple crayon, had indeed changed the world. One heart at a time. The courtroom was smaller than Tommy had expected, but it felt enormous with the weight of decisions that would shape the rest of his life. At 7 years old now, he sat between Bear and Mrs. Henderson, wearing his best blue shirt and holding the wooden cross that had never left his side since Bear carved it for him. Judge Patricia Hernandez had presided over family court for 15 years, long enough to distinguish between relationships built on convenience and those forged from genuine love. The adoption hearing had drawn more attention than any case in her career, but she was determined to make her decision based on one factor alone: what was in the best interest of the child sitting before her. The evidence was overwhelming. Character witnesses filled the gallery. Teachers, neighbors, fellow veterans, community leaders, and representatives from the dozens of charitable organizations that Bear and his brothers supported. The letters of recommendation filled 3 binders, each one testament to men who had chosen service over self-interest. Margaret Walsh presented the final piece of evidence, a group photograph taken at Bear's house the previous weekend. Tommy sat in the center, surrounded by his 5 Hells Angels dads, all of them grinning at the camera with the unguarded joy of people who had found exactly where they belonged. "Your Honor," Margaret said, "this photograph tells the real story. This is not about a motorcycle club seeking publicity or a child being exploited for media attention. This is about a family that chose each other, and the court's opportunity to make that choice legally permanent." The opposition attorney, representing the Children's Advocacy Coalition, made her final argument about proper procedures and conventional family structures. But her words felt hollow against the evidence of love and commitment that filled the courtroom. Judge Hernandez turned to Tommy, her voice gentle but serious. "Tommy, do you understand what adoption means?" Tommy nodded solemnly. It means Bear gets to be my real dad forever, not just for visits. And it means I get to be his real son, not just somebody he's nice to. And is that what you want? Tommy looked at Bear, then back at the judge. His voice was clear and confident. Bear is already my real dad. The papers would just make it so other people know it too. The simplicity of his answer captured something that all the legal arguments had missed: the difference between legal relationships and authentic ones. Tommy and Bear had become father and son the moment Bear knelt down at the charity event and said yes to a child's impossible request. Judge Hernandez reviewed her notes one final time, then looked up at the assembled group. Mr. Mackenzie, approaching this decision, I have considered every aspect of your background, your character, your ability to provide a stable home, and most importantly, your relationship with Tommy. Bear felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he waited for words that would either fulfill his greatest hope or deliver his worst fear. In 30 years of family law, Judge Hernandez continued, I have rarely seen such unanimous community support for an adoption petition. More importantly, I have rarely seen a child so clearly articulate his own desires and understanding of what family means. She picked up her gavel, the sound echoing through the courtroom as she spoke the words that would change everything. The petition for adoption is granted. Mr. Mackenzie, you are now legally recognized as Tommy's father, with all the rights and responsibilities that entails. The courtroom erupted in celebration. Mrs. Henderson wiped away tears as Tommy launched himself into Bear's arms. The Hells Angels stood as one, their leather-clad presence a stark contrast to the formal courthouse setting, but their joy authentic and overwhelming. Bear held his son, his actual, legal, forever son, and felt a completeness he had never imagined possible. The scared little boy who had approached him at a charity event had become the center of his world. The reason he woke up each morning with purpose and gratitude as they left the courthouse, Tommy walking proudly beside his father while photographers captured the moment. A reporter called out one final question. Tommy, what would you tell other kids who are waiting for their families? Tommy stopped and considered the question with the seriousness of someone who understood that his words might matter to children around the world who felt as alone as he once had. Don't give up, he said, his 7-year-old voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had learned that courage and love could overcome any obstacle. And be brave enough to ask for what you need, because somewhere out there's somebody who's waiting to say yes. You just have to be brave enough to find them. Bear placed his hand on his son's shoulder as they walked toward their motorcycle, toward home, toward a future filled with the ordinary miracles of chosen family, homework help and bedtime stories, motorcycle lessons and life wisdom, and the daily reminder that love multiplies when shared freely. Behind them, the courthouse stood as witness to the legal completion of a relationship that had begun with a child's simple wish and a group of men brave enough to say yes to love.